So let me also welcome you all to this webinar on Agile Leadership. I'm excited and privileged to be here with you again today, although I'm in UK and you're in Bahrain. I'm envious of that because here in UK at the moment it's a bit dull, and I guess it's not like that in Bahrain. It's not my first time with you though, because last year I delivered a webinar on workforce trends, and I've had a long association with BEPA and Bahrain stretching back to around 2010, and in particular with the Quada program run by BEPA, which I designed and delivered over a number of years, particularly from cohorts Quada 3 to Quada 8. And I'm still involved in the Llama program. Also, I'd like to mention that I have a long association with the Gulf as well, because I lived and worked in Abu Dhabi and indeed was the CEO of a leadership company, which we started and grew from around 6 people to around 250 people over a few years. And when I left that particular role, I also then stayed within the Gulf region and worked as a management consultant, delivering projects across the whole of the Gulf countries, except Qatar, working with many of the large companies, including in Bahrain, Bapco, Tatooine, Noga Holdings, but also all of the other major oil and gas companies in those other Gulf countries. So I guess really what I'm saying here as I start this webinar is that I do have some understanding of the work environment in the Gulf, and I hope to bring that sort of perspective to what we're going to be talking about today, Agile Leadership. But before we do talk about Agile Leadership, I'd like to set the contents. I think it's important that we do set the context for what we're going to be talking about shortly. And so I'd like to talk about two particular things with respect to context and setting context. Over the past few years, we've been hit by a great deal of volatility. When you think of COVID-19 and the aftermath of COVID-19 as it is now, remote working, or should I say that move to hybrid working, which is probably prevalent here in the UK and also in Bahrain, the joining in the workforce of the millennials and Generation Z workforce, each with their own different ambitions, career motivations and drive, but certainly their need for greater flexibility at work, and also their drive to be part of a purpose-driven organization. And then, of course, with the beginning of the industrial fourth revolution, with its focus on digitization and the complex environment that we work in, leadership has had to raise the game in our leadership. We've almost accelerated 10 years in our thinking about leadership and the application of leadership in organizations. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Leadership has had and is becoming more caring, it's becoming more empathic, it has to be more adaptable and flexible, innovative and enabling and encouraging, so that we can get the best out of our people. And getting the best out of our people is a key driver for growth, as is an aligned leadership and cohesive team, which helps drive that growth, revenue, profitability, and in the public sector, that idea of trust with citizens as we deliver services to them. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Context in that respect has accelerated our thinking about leadership and our application of leadership. The second point I'd like to make in terms of context is that we can't take leadership out of the idea of culture. Now, culture works on two levels, really. You've got the organizational level of culture, the existing cultures that live within organizations, and those can be a driver for change, or they can be a bit of a stop to change in the way that that culture has been devolved. Nonetheless, we need to be thinking about organizational culture in terms of the leadership styles that we adopt, which fit with that culture. But more importantly, and what trumps organizational culture is national culture, culture at a national level. Each country has its own culture. And if you study the work of Hofstede, you'll understand the cultural dimensions that he talks about in terms of individualism and collectivism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and whether or not culture is long-term or short-term oriented. Those influence, that culture will influence what is acceptable in terms of leadership and leadership styles and the way that we view and think about leadership and apply leadership. And in the Bahrain cultural context, when you look at it according to Hofstede, and this is sort of verified by my working in Bahrain, you know, there are strong family ties is part of the cultural landscape. Respect for hierarchy is part of the cultural landscape. An emphasis on relationship building, consensus building, a communication style which is polite and sometimes indirect. Flexibility and adaptability, you know, is embedded within the culture of Bahrain, being an island. And modesty and humility and the building of long-term relationships. All of these cultural aspects of Bahrain will have an impact on what is acceptable in terms of leadership and leadership styles and the way that we treat people and the way that we go about our business in an organization. And so those are the 2 points I would like to make as we now begin to look at agile leadership. And as we do so, please jot down any questions you may have so that we'll have some time at the end to answer those questions. So leadership must be seen in terms of context. Now, so thinking about this context, we're going to discuss the topic of agile leadership, which in a business landscape is characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, the so-called VUCA landscape. And agile leadership has emerged as a powerful response to these VUCA demands on us that are placed on us as leaders. And so in this short time with you, we're going to explore the core essentials of agile leadership. We'll look at a definition. We'll look at the characteristics, we'll look at the principles, we'll look at then how we can begin to apply agile leadership within our organizations, and I'll pick out some examples for you. And then we'll finish by highlighting the emphasizing the role that responsibility and trust has in building and creating an agile environment and culture where people and teams can thrive. Agile leadership is promoted as a more effective style of leadership to navigate this VUCA environment. And it's a style that embraces the principles of agile methodologies, which grew up in the tech world and particularly in the software, in software businesses and so on. It's characterized by flexibility, collaboration, rapid iteration of ideas, and rapid iteration of responses to challenges and problem solving. Its particular focus is to deliver value to customers, because there is a value chain that we need to be aware of as leaders, a value chain that starts with people delivering value to customers, that value creating satisfied and loyal customers, and that loyalty driving increased revenue, profit, and growth of a business. And as I said, in the public sector, increased trust in the services that we provide. So that there is a little virtuous chain here in terms of delivering value to customers. It emphasizes the need for collaboration and innovation, and centers around the idea of customer centricity in our organizations in terms of the values that we have within the organization. Now, having said that, it's different from what is seen as traditional leadership. You know, that hierarchical, command and control style of leadership that came out of the first, the second industrial revolutions, and then actually was still, in my experience, still prevalent in many organizations up until the advent of COVID, where we've had to rethink our style of leadership, as I mentioned previously, in terms of culture and context. So this idea of traditional leadership was about relying on our leaders. It was a top-down approach. It was providing direction and control with an emphasis on being efficient, with an emphasis on what we would call scientific management, management by objectives, and so on. Although you can see elements of enlightened leadership adopting some of these principles of agile leadership. And so I would argue, in some case, I would argue that actually agile leadership, for me, is just effective leadership. Effective leadership in the sense that, you know, we lead to achieve results, but we can't achieve results without people, so that we have to take care of our people in order to bring out the best from them and engage them so that they can go on and deliver value to customers and so on and be part of that value chain. So I would argue at one level that agile leadership is effective leadership, and the idea of that first point in cultural context has brought that to the fore, and maybe we put a term around it called agile leadership. I'll let you be the judge of that, but certainly it is different from what we consider to be this idea of traditional leadership, this top-down directive, controlling, sometimes micromanaging approach, which, if you've experienced that, is very disengaging and does not bring out the best in terms of our people. But I just want to make and reiterate the key focus on the difference is about this adaptability, this idea of empowering teams, enabling teams, encouraging teams to make decisions and take ownership and be accountable for their work. That in organizations, if it's adopted, tends to lead to flatter organizations and more cross-functional collaboration and engagement, as team members become more invested in the success of the company, much more so than under traditional leadership. And of course, that's what we want. We spend most of our working lives in work. And so we certainly want it to be a productive, happy, and engaging place. So when we look at the principles of agile leadership, think about growth mindset. That mindset that is open to learning, that mindset that is open to challenges, that mindset that embraces the idea of failure and almost reframes that into opportunities for learning and opportunities for improvement. But at the foundation of these principles is this idea of us as leaders. We model the way. We need to be an example. People do not do as we say. People do as we do. And so it's so important that us as leaders embrace the principles and enact the principles and be the change that we want to see, be the light in the darkness. Without that modeling of the way, without that alignment to the values and principles of agile leadership, then it is very unlikely that we can build a culture of agile leadership in any organization. So that's a very important point to bear in mind. Be the example, model the way. But having said that, then there are 9 principles of agile leadership that I'd like to introduce you to. Now, I'll give you a few minutes to read the slide, and then I'm going to talk about some of the principles and draw out some points about them. So you notice that the principles are under three main areas of communication, commitment, and collaboration. And when you look at these principles, maybe or maybe not, it reinforces the idea that agile leadership is just effective leadership. And agile leadership encompasses those things that we believe to be good about leadership and that we should be implementing in our own vision of being a leader and how we lead to achieve results. So let me just pick out one or two. We improve, looking at principle 3, we improve through effective feedback. And so as leaders, we need to be comfortable with asking for feedback about the way that we lead, and feedback in terms of what we're doing in organizations, and feedback in terms of the way that we address challenges and problems and solutions, whether they be from our own people, whether they be from our suppliers, whether they be from our customers. Ask. And once we hear and we listen and understand, we can then use that feedback to improve performance. But also there's another way of improving, gathering feedback through lots of after action reviews in what we do in organizations. But I'd like to also talk to you a little bit about the idea of gathering feedback before we even start to implement a plan or a project or a solution, by looking at the idea of a pre-mortem. Now, a pre-mortem is the idea of almost black hatting the plan or project by planning a project and thinking about a project, and then getting the team together to say, now, what are the risks inherent? What could go wrong, so that we can address those before we even launch. So improving through feedback is a very important aspect of agile leadership, and seeking feedback and not being afraid, but certainly to act on that feedback. Principle 4, when we think back to, and I know that Bahrain has a young workforce, and in UK now it's becoming more prevalent. A lot of people did not go back to work. A lot of baby boomers of my age decided to not go back to work after COVID, and sort of semi-retired and looked for alternative ways of working, etc. But millennials and Generation Z, they, far greater than the other generation, seek meaning and purpose. And so in terms of employer branding, etc., within our organizations, it's something that we need to tap into, and we need to think about how our core values align with talking about meaning and purpose to attract and retain good people who will become productive, engaged, and loyal, and help us achieve the results that we want to achieve. And so that's something to think about. Generating as a leader meaning and purpose, and talking about meaning and purpose, and talking about why, which is very, very important. Now, the other two principles I'd just like to point out are principle 7, where we devolve power and authority through delegation. It's not about us controlling. It's not about us as a leader being the sage on the stage and having to know all the answers. It's about delegating and sharing, and being comfortable with the idea of delegating, and empowering our employees through this delegation and set of leadership practices. And so we have to be comfortable with delegation, and we have to understand how to delegate with our people. The last principle I'd like to just highlight to you is the principle of collaboration and building communities of people, empowering and trusting a team through delegation, and giving them a sense of ownership and accountability for their results. Allowing team members to make decisions because you set the expectations about where we're going and the results we need to achieve, and then letting those teams of people decide on how they're going to achieve the results. Of course, in terms of accountability, we're going to set up monitoring mechanisms in terms of measurement and metrics. But essentially, it's being comfortable with the idea of building these communities and encouraging and enabling these teams and empowering them to make their own decisions and hold them accountable for those decisions, and not so much getting involved in the how, but allowing our teams to think about the how they're going to do something to achieve the results. Now, having picked out some of those principles, I need to make the point that these principles are interconnected and they should be applied effectively. Effective Agile leaders will tailor their approaches to emphasize the principles that align with their team needs and the organization objectives and the organization culture. And so, well, a point of emphasis in terms of the principles may change from organization to organization, but nonetheless, it's important to understand what the principles are and to be thinking about the implementation of those to build an agile organization. And that brings me neatly onto the idea of applying the principles of agile leadership. So what do we need to do to apply those principles? What do we need to focus on? And there are 4 key areas that I suggest that we focus on: governance, structures, process, and mindset. And we're going to have a look at each of these 4 areas in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with governance. When we look at traditional governance, it's often hierarchical and it's often very lengthy in terms of its decision making. Ideas have to float to the top, ideas then have to be looked at the top, and then an answer comes back. And sometimes, as we all know, things may float to the top and no answers come back, let alone an answer that takes some time to come back. And so that's a really big difference. And our thinking around governance is, how do we alter that slow decision-making process? What is the framework we need to put around so that we have decisions which are made very quickly and autonomously and allowed to be made by teams on the ground who are often very closer to the customer than us leaders in the at the top end would tend to be a bit of a distance away from customers. So in terms of that framework, it's important that the way that we grow and build our organization is to have everybody aligned on our core values, on our core purpose, on our vision for the organization, the target that we're trying to achieve, and that we set expectations in discussion around core values and core purpose. And we involve our people in reviewing and looking at or building core values within our organization, those behaviors which are important to us. These are the sort of framework that we need to put around the idea of helping teams make decisions quickly and act autonomously. They need a playing field to play on, a framework which comes from purpose, values, vision, expectations, a picture of what success looks like within the organization or within their team, a set of objectives which are aligned with the company objectives and perhaps the functional objectives and the team objectives and the individual objectives, one complete alignment, so that we can say that in simple terms, ask the question of ourselves in a team: is the decision that I'm about to make going to lead me towards the achievement of my individual objective, the achievement of the team objective, the functional objective, and the company objective? And if it is, let's do it. And if it's not, let's think twice about what we're about to do. And so that's the sort of framework that we need to set around in terms of governance. And then hold people accountable for the decisions they make. And the point here is that accountability, I'll make that point again, is around tying clear metrics that align with those organizational goals and objectives, metrics which are leading metrics, not those that are lagging metrics, revenue being a classic lagging metric. We want the drivers of revenue. We want the drivers of what we're going to do. We need to measure those so that if we're off track in our targets, then we can do something about it by influencing the way that we do things to influence the metric. So that's what we mean by clear metrics that align with organizational goals. With metrics and that clear framework. And one other thing, a clear communication communication rhythm of meetings, which may include daily huddles, weekly team meetings, monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, etc. A rhythm of meetings which are effective in cascading communication throughout the organization and sharing things. That's the sort of agile governance framework we need to put in place, because with that framework in place, we'll be able to act very quickly if things change within our environment, or customer needs change, or we're innovating a product and we've put it out into the workplace and we need to change the product for whatever reason. So we need to be agile and set that governance around it in that way. Now, in terms of examples of agile governance, Spotify at a bigger level is a classic example of the sort of governance there that they put in place, the one I've described. But also in Bahrain, there is picked out Gulf Future Business Services, which is a consulting firm. And they pride themselves on building a governance structure around a very collaborative model of working both internally and with working with their partners and clients to tackle very complex challenges. And so their model is built around enhancing collaboration and accountability within their consulting teams, allowing them to make decisions quickly and autonomously to better serve the client and lead the client through the complex challenges they're facing. So let's move on now to agile structures. We've been talking a lot about teams and collaborating teams, but here we're talking about the idea of creating cross-functional teams that work together to deliver value to customers. Very often, if you go into organizations, particularly large organizations, they become siloed over time. Those bureaucratic principles and structure permeate the organization, which create functional silos. And in some organizations that I've worked in and seen, not only silos, but also battles between them. Marketing battling with sales, sales battling with operations because operations are not delivering the promises delivered to the customer by sales. Delivery and operations saying, well, you've overpromised, and so on. Finance operating in its own silo as a bit of a black art, and so on. So these silos are not conducive to collaboration and agility and innovation. They slow things down, they block things, they resist change. And so we ought to be thinking about the idea of cross-functional teams, of bringing teams together, which consist of the various functions, to look at challenges, to innovate, to improve, to bring fresh ideas to the table, with all views and opinions considered by using that cross-functional team. I guess in terms of many organizations that are customer facing, the idea of customer success teams can be very successful in building that cross-functional team so that we can deliver real success to customers, particularly those who are perhaps unhappy with what they've been delivered, and so on. So agile teams are cross-functional and they have a shared goal of delivery to customers. And that enables faster decision making, reduces the need for extensive communication between the functions and loss of that communication. And they create a much more collaborative environment where team members learn from each other and share knowledge. And it's far more enjoyable to work collaboratively in that way. So that's setting up agile structures. Ing Bank, the Dutch multinational bank, has adopted a tribe structure where employees are grouped into cross-functional teams, and that seems to be working very well for them. But in Bahrain, when you look at Batelco, they have adopted a cross-functional team structure to streamline their operations and enhance their customer service. And that's enshrined almost within their I care model, if you like, teams working together to deliver value to customers. Also note, as you look at the I care model that they have adopted, notice the principles of agile leadership showing up in almost all area of that I care model: accountability, empowerment, being responsive, competitive, innovative. And so there's a great example of an agile structure being put in place by a company in Bahrain. We move on to look at agile processes. Agile processes and implementing agile process is about applying iterative approaches to solve challenges, and then looking at this idea of feedback that we talked about early and often. In traditional development, I dare say in problem solving in traditional organizations, it's often developed in a linear fashion. We've got an idea, let's work on an idea, let's push the idea up, as I discussed earlier. It's very linear with extensive planning and design, particularly in terms of product development within traditional organizations. In an agile organization, that's far too slow. In an agile organization, product and service development take place in a very short iterative cycles where we work on the idea of a minimum viable product or service. Let's just get it out there and let's use our customer base in order to iterate that to improve it. It's almost this idea of imperfect action. Some action is better than no action. So rather than having these long gestation periods where we're trying to be 100% perfect in what we do, let's just get something out there. Let's see how it goes. Let's ask and get feedback, and let's iterate that process and keep on doing that until we're able to hit the sweet spot and then systemize and automate what we're doing. Now, I talked in terms there of product and service development, but also iterative approaches will apply also in our governance structure and the way that we structure our organization, because by setting up this rhythm of meetings, by having a mindset of getting stuff out there and looking at this idea of gutting things out and being imperfect, then that opens up the whole area of improvement processes within our organization and externally to get something done, then look at how it's gone, seek feedback and iterate it. And so that cycle is important. And in many organizations now who are looking to grow and build revenue, profit and value into the business, they will work within an iterative cycle of a 90-day world, where they will look at a 3-year picture for the organization. They will look at a 1-year set of metrics and targets and objectives for the organization, split those objectives up into quarterly objectives, and then look at the quarterly objectives, prioritize those, and work towards achieving those by setting their company objectives for the quarter, their functional objectives for the quarter, their team and individual objectives. And so they would work for 90 days in that 90-day sprint, and at the end of the 90 sprint, have a quarterly meeting to see how we've done, and then reset objectives and priorities for the next quarter. And that's a sort of governance structure using an agile process. But one of the most popular agile frameworks that you could use also is the idea of Scrum, and they work in 2-week sprints followed by review and planning. The key thing here is that we're looking for an iterative approach to what we're doing, one that is not afraid to be iterative and get something done and get something out there, get the feedback, and then make it better as we move along, and being more comfortable with that rather than seeking perfection all the time before we implement anything. So that's an agile process and thought process that we need to build into the organization. Bahrain Polytechnic is a great example of this in the way that they build their programs, their development programs and training programs and courses. They are deliberately focused on making them relevant and responsive to the changing labor market needs that you have in Bahrain, and very alive to what those needs are, and not afraid to iterate a course, not afraid to use a design process that throws something out there and says, you know, what do you think? And then build those ideas into their courses to meet the needs of the labor market. So that's a great example of the way that an entity in Bahrain uses Agile and implements Agile methodologies to enhance their course offerings. Of course, classically, in terms of bigger organizations, the Amazon Web Services do this all the time, where they're looking and gaining feedback from customers using Amazon to deliver new features quickly. And that's how they can get those new features out very quickly, because they're constantly surveying and getting feedback and responding to that feedback quickly. And of course, the classic Agile process came out of Toyota and the lean movement and their streamlining of their production processes. So that is a way looking at those four areas that we can begin to think about implementing Agile leadership within our organization. But it relies entirely on the fourth area, Agile mindset. You know, mindset trumps skills. Mindset operates at the higher level. It's a mindset of beliefs and values that we have that operates above skills and training. And so if we try to implement Agile leadership, or indeed any other form of new change within the organization, without the mindset to do it, without addressing the mindset, beliefs and values within our organization, then it's doomed for failure. And so that's something that actually moves back towards this idea of purpose, company purpose and company values, growth mindset. So we've got to have the right mindset to implement. Without the right mindset to implement, we're not going to be able to endorse any change or make any change towards Agile leadership. And so that mindset is one about customer centricity. It's customer focused. It's adaptive. Typical growth mindset stuff. And it's that willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. That willingness to be uncomfortable with ambiguity, or sorry, to be comfortable with ambiguity, to not be fazed by ambiguity, to not be frozen by ambiguity. During COVID, many companies that I worked with and had the privilege to help pivoted in terms of what they were doing. They had to move from a rigid mindset in the services they were providing for customers, and they almost had to go back to the business model canvas and look at the idea of what are the changing needs and trends that COVID has inspired, and how are we going to survive? Well, to do that, we're going to need to pivot, and we've got to have the mindset. And those companies that had that Agile mindset, that had that growth mindset, actually came out of COVID stronger than those who buried their heads in the sand or froze and didn't really know what to do or how to move forward, and didn't have that sort of growth mindset and Agile mindset. They didn't do so well. So that's the fourth thing that we need to implement practically within our organization to make sure we have the right mindset to deliver on the promises of Agile leadership. Now, one such company, if you can call it a company, is the Bahrain Fintech Bay. They are a leading fintech hub, as you probably well know, one of the leading ones in the MENA region, and they're all about incubating. They're all about driving initiatives through innovation. And of course, what they do and they will practice is this idea of having an agile mindset to do so. You cannot innovate and incubate without it. You cannot innovate and incubate without the idea of iterative thought processes, so that you get the right product out to the right customers, and not find, as in traditional approaches, that we've taken a massive amount of time to develop a product that nobody wants. And the business landscape is replete with many companies who had done that. So an agile mindset company, Bahrain Fintech Bay, is a classic example of encouraging that within the companies that work within the hub. Now we can now move on to the last piece of the jigsaw in terms of building this sustainable agile culture within our organization. And at the heart of building this agile culture is the idea of responsibility. And I would add accountability with that, and trust. Responsibility and accountability is about that notion of empowering teams to take ownership. We need to provide that clear vision. We need to set the expectations. We need to delegate to empower. We need to enable. We need to encourage our people to make decisions within the boundaries of what we're trying to do and the targets and the results that we're trying to achieve. Now, that requires a high degree of transparency. It goes back to modeling the way. It goes back to setting the example. It goes back to not being afraid to tell it how it is, to talk about the brutal truth within an organization, and have that transparency in terms of planning, to involve people in planning and communicating, using that rhythm of communication that we talked about, from daily hubs up to quarterly and annual meetings, so everybody understands the role that they have to play, where they fit within the organization and the objectives they're working towards. Once we've achieved that, we can hold people responsible and accountable for their results. Without that, how do we hold people responsible and accountable for results? And it would be very unfair to expect them to achieve results without that responsibility and accountability. And so that is an extremely important part of building a culture. And let's face it, not all leaders are comfortable in being transparent and giving up control and delegating. And it's something they need to work on in terms of their mindset, if they are to get the best out of people, to get people to bring their best self to work, and not just rely on this, I tell you what to do, you do it, which leads to, as all of the polls, all the Gallup polls suggest throughout time, leads to a very disengaged workforce, a workforce at its worst who stays in the job because they can't find a better job. And that's not a recipe for delivering results. But in order to do that and build this responsibility, accountability, we need to create this culture of trust where people feel safe. And again, it comes from us as leaders, by setting this example, by feeling safe to speak up, by taking risks, by taking and thinking of failure, not in a negative sense, but as an opportunity to learn, and espousing that in the way that we talk, in the way that we do things. So again, it's this idea of not just saying that, but actually allowing that to happen, because your people will be watching you in the way that you lead. And if you're talking about, yes, it's okay, we'll look at failure as a learning opportunity, and then people don't achieve what they want to achieve, and we come down on them like a ton of bricks, then that's a problem. That's a problem that will destroy culture, that will destroy trust rather than build it. So we need to create this safe environment. And the words here are this idea of psychological safety, this idea of us as leaders being more empathic, more caring around our people, being more explanatory, communicating the why, by making people feel safe that they can take the risks, and we'll use that as a learning opportunity if things don't work out the way we want, and we'll iterate to the next improvement, if you like. So we're always learning. That's how we build trust. And trust, I guess, in a way, is around treating people in the way that we would like to be treated, that golden rule. It's not difficult, it's not simple, but on the other hand, it's simple but not easy. So we need to build that culture of trust within the organization, and it starts from us. And by doing that, we create the psychological safety where we can learn from our mistakes and engage in productive conflict. By doing that and building responsibility and trust, we begin to build the culture necessary for agile leadership to thrive, and indeed for people to thrive. So let me just recap. In conclusion, agile leadership is a leadership style that emphasizes flexibility, collaboration, and rapid iteration to deliver value to customers. It's different from traditional leadership in that it empowers and enables teams to make decisions, and indeed encourages teams to make decisions and take ownership for their work. And by doing that, they become responsible and accountable for their work. And then we set up governance and structures in order to frame that so that we're achieving the results the organization needs to achieve to grow and sustain itself. To apply agile principles, leaders need to model the way and be the change that they are trying to inspire. Inspire, not tell, inspire. So to do that, we also need to focus on and think about what are the governance structure that we need to put in place, what are the processes, and what is the mindset we need to encourage within our organization. And so that brings our look at agile leadership to a close. I would just probably add, before I do throw it open to questions, that you know, adopting this agile leadership is not without challenge. It's not easy to particularly change culture within an organization if you need to. It does require a significant focus and significant efforts around leading change and this willingness to experiment. So having said that, then I will, in the last 10 minutes, throw it open to anybody who would like to ask any questions.